They called him crazy old man, said he muttered to himself, said he talked to a shed like it could hear. Kids dared each other to knock on his door. Adults warned their children not to get too close. He walked the same path every morning with a toolbox and locked himself inside a rusted structure no bigger than a garden shack. No one cared what was inside. No one asked. Until one night, 2 teenagers broke the lock and forced the door open. And by sunrise, a black van marked Federal Bureau of Investigation had blocked the road. Agents in suits surrounded the shed. And the entire town that once laughed, they watched in stunned silence as a man they dismissed for years was saluted by federal officers like someone with clearance far above their pay grade. Backhand index pointing right. If that gave you chills, you're in the right place. Like, share, and subscribe to Endless Stories, where the loudest truths often come wrapped in silence. Military Metal Endless Stories, where legacy whispers louder than history books. He'd lived in the same corner house for nearly 30 years, the kind with peeling paint and a porch that creaked like it resented every step. He didn't plant flowers, didn't wave to neighbors, didn't go to church, the barber, or the 4th of July barbecue. What he did, every single morning at 6 a.m. sharp, was walk the dirt trail from his back door to an old, tin-roofed shed sitting 20 yards behind the tree line. Toolbox in hand, thermos tucked under his arm, and that same faded green jacket zipped all the way to the neck, even in the summer. Most of the town stopped noticing after a while. He became background noise, the guy parents warned kids to stay away from, not out of malice but confusion. Just a little off, they'd whisper. Harmless, but strange. No one ever asked what was in the shed. Not when he reinforced the door with steel brackets. Not when a new padlock appeared every few months. Not when a motion-activated light started clicking on at random hours in the night. The teenagers made up stories, of course. That he was ex-military. That he was hiding gold or weapons or bodies. That the government once tracked him and gave up. They'd dare each other to run up and bang on the shed door, then run like hell when the porch light flickered on. But no one ever really knew because no one ever really listened. The truth was, he didn't talk much. Not at the store. Not at the gas station. Not when the delivery guy dropped his groceries once a week. But sometimes, when no one was around, when the wind was still and the birds had stopped, he'd lean against the shed wall, whisper something to the wood, then nod like he'd been answered. He never looked angry, never looked afraid, just tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. There was one person who tried, a librarian named Miss Howard, now retired, who used to bring him boxes of old tech magazines and radio schematics. She said he never asked for them, but always returned them clean, folded, and annotated. He's not crazy, she once said to a friend. He's just full of silence. No one paid her much mind. But silence, as the town was about to learn, isn't emptiness. Sometimes, it's the sound of something waiting. And one night, when 2 kids broke the lock for a dare, that silence was broken. And everything changed. It started with a laugh. Not a scream. Not a bang. Just the kind of laugh teenage boys make when they think they've gotten away with something. Tyler and Mason had bragged for weeks they were going to break into the crazy old guy's shed. Film it, post it online, and rake in likes for finally doing what no one else dared. That night, they waited until the neighborhood fell asleep, cut through the woods behind the property, and pried open the back of the old chain-link fence. It took them 17 minutes to reach the shed door, for it to cut the lock. When the door finally creaked open, Tyler shined his phone's flashlight inside and let out a low, "Dude!" Inside wasn't what they expected. No tools, no piles of junk, no crates full of doomsday prep gear. It was neat, clean. The walls were lined with custom shelving, meticulously labeled in a handwriting far too steady to belong to a madman. Stacked in perfect rows were what looked like communication gear, radios, encryption boards, analog circuits, dusty but not forgotten. On the back wall, mounted dead center, was an emblem, a patch encased in a shadow box with military precision. But what froze them wasn't the patch. It was the glowing green panel beneath it. One red light, blinking, slow. And beneath it, a label, "Do not touch, monitored." Tyler laughed nervously. This dude's a freaking nutcase. Then he reached for the panel. That's when the shed lit up. Not from inside, but from outside. Flashing lights, headlights, the roar of multiple vehicles barreling down the dead-end street. In under 2 minutes, the shed was surrounded. Black SUVs, unmarked. For men in suits stepped out fast, not guns drawn, but with posture that made it clear. No one moves without orders. Mason dropped his phone. Tyler raised both hands. The door was yanked wide and the boys were pulled out with practiced calm. One agent ducked inside, took one glance around, then spoke softly into a headset. Across the street, porch lights flicked on, curtains parted, and people began to gather, barefoot, in robes, confused. That's when they saw him, the old man, already dressed, already waiting. He walked down his porch steps slowly, without panic, without surprise, and nodded once at the lead agent. The agent stepped forward, removed his sunglasses, and saluted. Not a nod, a salute, full posture, hand to brow, held it for 3 seconds before speaking. "Sir, we didn't think you were still active." The old man didn't reply. He didn't need to, because by that point, the entire town had gone quiet. Not from fear, but from realization. The crazy old man wasn't crazy. He was classified. By morning, the rumors had already twisted themselves into knots. Some said he was CIA. Others whispered NSA. One woman insisted she saw a tattoo on the lead agent's wrist that meant counterintelligence in Latin. But none of them had real answers because the only one who knew anything wasn't speaking. Not to the press. Not to the neighbors. Not even to the sheriff, who arrived late and stood helplessly on the curb, watching federal agents walk in and out of a shed he had never once thought twice about. What stood out more than the silence was the respect. Every agent who entered the shed did so like it was sacred ground. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They moved like men who had received a briefing that included a single name and were told to treat it like command. Later that day, Miss Howard, yes, the retired librarian, came by. She brought with her a box. Inside were 32 pages of schematics, notes, and technical diagrams in the old man's handwriting. She had kept them for years. When an agent saw the box, he paused. "Where did you get these?" he asked, voice low but firm. She straightened her back. "He used to read in my library," she said. "Returned everything cleaner than when he took it out, including ideas no one else understood." The agent took one look inside, then closed the lid carefully and said, "Ma'am, these designs are 15 years ahead of anything we've got on file." Word traveled fast after that. The townspeople who once laughed now spoke in hush. Parents told their children not to mock what they didn't understand. And somewhere between dusk and dawn, the nickname Crazy Old Man quietly disappeared. What replaced it wasn't a name. It was a pause. That respectful, knowing pause people give when walking past a man they'll never fully understand. But no better than to underestimate again. The folder was unmarked. No barcode. No case number. Just a plain, faded manila envelope tucked beneath a weathered canvas bag inside the shed. The agent who found it didn't touch it right away. He stared for a moment, as if trying to decide whether this was something he was cleared to see, or something no one was supposed to. When he opened it, there weren't many pages. Just 4. One was a map with no borders. Another was a coded message printed on aging thermal paper. The third was a roster of names. 5 of them crossed out in red, 1 underlined in black. And the 4th was a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken at night in what looked like the corner of a jungle. In the photo, a younger version of the old man stood beside a group of figures too shadowed to identify, all facing away from the camera, toward something burning just outside the frame. That operation was never listed in the official database. It didn't have a code name. It didn't appear in Pentagon logs or archived intelligence reports. But one of the agents recognized the coordinates on the map and froze. He walked outside the shed, motioned for the others, and spoke in a low voice that barely rose above the wind. This guy was part of the ghost unit. That term made the others stop. Not in confusion, in reverence. Because the ghost unit wasn't supposed to exist. It was the kind of thing mentioned in dark corners of training sessions, a whispered legacy passed between soldiers who knew better than to ask too much. The man who had lived on the edge of town, who mowed his own lawn and rebuilt radios from the 60s, had once led a mission so far off-grid it never returned home. Only fragments of it did. He was one of those fragments, and he'd carried the weight of that night in silence, never once asking to be seen, never once asking to be thanked. One of the younger agents, too young to understand the full gravity, asked the lead, "Why didn't he report in? Why disappear?" The lead replied, "Men like him didn't go dark. They were told to, and they stayed that way, because silence was the last order they ever got." Outside the shed, the sky was turning gold, and inside, under the metal roof that had shielded more than just tools, the truth sat quietly. Not hidden, just waiting for someone worthy enough to find it. He used to ride by the house every Friday, usually after school, dragging the back brake of his bike so it screeched just loud enough to echo across the old man's yard. Sometimes he'd shout something dumb, "Hey, Fort Knox, got aliens in there?" Then pedal away, laughing with his friends. It wasn't out of hate. It was boredom. It was a teenager's way of reacting to something they didn't understand. A man alone, a shed always locked, no lawn decorations, no trick or treat signs on Halloween, just silence. The day the FBI showed up, the boy was walking home instead of riding. His bike had a flat tire. He heard the engines before he saw the black SUVs. The red and blue strobes flashed off the windows of houses he'd grown up passing without ever noticing. And when he saw the suits, the radios, and the unmarked gear being carried into the shed, his mouth went dry. He stood frozen at the corner, hoodie pulled up, earbuds dangling uselessly around his neck. The old man wasn't yelling. He wasn't even surprised. He stood at the edge of his porch, straight-backed, as one of the agents saluted him like he was someone who still wore command. That moment didn't leave the boy. He went home, skipped video games, skipped dinner, just stared out the window at nothing in particular. That night, he found the only photo he had of his grandfather. A man he barely remembered, who had once worn the same kind of jacket the old man wore every day. He Googled patches. He searched for shed radios. And for the first time, not out of curiosity, but out of need, he began to wonder, what did I miss? The next afternoon, he walked back. No screeching tires. No sarcasm. Just his flat-tired bike resting against a fence post and a boy holding something in his hands. A paper star, folded carefully, sloppily, but honest. He didn't go to the door, didn't ask questions. He just placed the star on the edge of the porch and walked away. He didn't expect it to be seen. But the next morning, the star was gone. And in its place was a single word, written in tight, block handwriting on the step in chalk. Understood. That was all he needed. Because some lessons aren't taught in class. They're learned in silence. By watching. By listening. By growing up just enough to finally see who's been standing guard all along. They found it tucked inside an old radio casing, hidden beneath a panel secured with rusted screws and a strip of aged duct tape. It wasn't marked top secret. It didn't have a seal, a signature, or an official header. Just a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, creased like it had been opened and closed 1,000 times but never mailed. The ink was handwritten, precise, calm, the kind of handwriting you see from men who've measured every word the way a soldier measures every step, carefully, like missteps can get someone hurt. It was addressed to the one who will one day ask why. No name, no date, just that. The letter wasn't long, but it read like a weight finally set down. Spoke of silence, not because of secrecy, but because of duty, of missions no one would ever know, and friends who never made it home. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded in ways the world wasn't ready to accept. It spoke of carrying more than equipment, of carrying memories that didn't ask to be remembered, only not to be betrayed. There was one line, though, that stopped the lead agent cold. I didn't stay quiet because I had to. I stayed quiet because that's what you do when you've seen the cost of being loud. At the bottom, no signature, just a single symbol, a triangle drawn with 3 initials tucked inside, LJW. The agent folded the letter slowly, then called the youngest member of the team over. "Read this," he said, "and don't take notes. Just read it." The young agent read it once, then again, then handed it back without a word. Because sometimes the truth isn't meant to be filed. It's meant to be carried, like a patch in a breast pocket, like a promise never spoken aloud. That night, the letter wasn't taken to HQ. It was sealed in a new envelope, placed inside a small metal box, and returned to the shed, back where it belonged. Because classified or not, that letter wasn't written for a file. It was written for the future, and now it had been heard. It wasn't announced. No security detail, no helicopters, just a black government sedan rolling quietly into town on a Sunday morning. The kind of vehicle that looked out of place against the cracked sidewalks and weather-worn storefronts. It pulled up in front of the old man's house, parked with surgical precision. The door opened, and out stepped a man in full dress uniform. Polished shoes, perfectly pressed blues, rows of ribbons and stars gleaming beneath the morning sun. His posture was unmistakable. Authority forged in combat, but carried now with grace. He walked alone to the porch, climbed the 3 steps slowly, and then he saluted. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. Inside the house, the old man opened the door, no surprise on his face, no hurry in his step. He didn't ask questions, didn't look shocked. He just stood in the doorway, still dignified, the exact image of a man who had long since made peace with shadows. The general dropped his hand slowly, then said one name, Commander Walters. It wasn't loud, but everyone within earshot heard it. The man once called crazy, the recluse, the ghost, the shed whisperer, now had a rank, and a legacy, and someone high enough to command continents had come all this way just to say it out loud. Neighbors watched from across the street, silent. Children looked to their parents, unsure why this moment made their stomachs feel tight. And the old man? He simply nodded and replied with 3 words he hadn't said in decades. "Yes, General." Reporting. They didn't go inside. They didn't shake hands. They just stood there. 2 men who had once lived in the same world, but had chosen different exits from it. And in that brief, breathless moment, something shifted in the air. Not just for them, for the town. Because when the general stepped back, saluted one last time, and left without a word, no one asked why he came. They understood. Some names don't need parades. They just need to be spoken by the right voice at the right time in front of the right people to bring the past home where it belongs. And that morning, Leonard J. Walters came home, not through headlines, but through honor. It wasn't built with ceremony. No ribbon was cut. No news crew arrived. No town funds were used. The wall started with just one photo, a grainy snapshot someone took the day the general saluted Leonard J. Walters on his porch. Someone printed it, slid it into a frame, and hung it just inside the diner near the back corner booth where the old man once sat, always alone, always facing the window. 2 days later, someone else brought a letter, a thank you note written by a Vietnam veteran who said he'd never met Commander Walters, but had once read his name in a list of unconfirmed assets passed around among special forces in '74. No one could prove it. No one needed to. By the end of the week, 5 more items appeared. A folded flag in a shadow box, a dog tag with no chain, a small photo of a young soldier holding a radio unit that looked eerily similar to the one found in the shed. The wall wasn't large, maybe 6 feet across, but people stopped as they passed it. Some lingered, some touched the glass. A few just stood in front of it with their hands behind their backs like they were in formation, remembering something they weren't even a part of, but now somehow felt. No one called it a memorial, not officially, but that's what it became. Not because of how it looked. There was no granite, no eternal flame, but because of what it meant. A reminder that some stories never made the papers. Some names never made the wall in DC, but their silence built just as much freedom. One afternoon, a teenager sat beneath the wall and wrote a poem in his notebook. He didn't sign it. He just left it taped to the corner of the frame. It read, "He sat alone, so we didn't have to. He stayed quiet so we could speak. He was forgotten so we could remember. No one removed it. They left it there. Because some words don't need to be published to be permanent. And that wall? It never asked to be sacred. It became that way because a town finally opened its eyes and saw who had been watching over them all along. They didn't come in formation. They didn't announce themselves. There were no flags waving from antennas or signs welcoming honored guests. They just arrived, 3 unmarked SUVs, parked along the diner's side lot, engines still ticking in the morning chill. The first to step out was a woman in uniform, hair pulled into a tight bun, medals arranged like punctuation across her chest. The second was a man, much older, walking with a cane but moving like he didn't need one. Not yet, not if it came to standing. Then came 6 more, some in dress blues, others in quiet, civilian suits that still carried the posture of discipline. They didn't walk straight to the wall. They paused first, outside, under the overhang of the diner, as if asking permission from the town itself. No one stopped them. No one had to. Inside, the regulars already knew something was different. The diner had gone silent the moment the first shadow passed by the window. The cook turned off the sizzle on the grill. The waitress set down the coffee pot mid-pour. And the teenage busboy, the one who once thought the wall was just some military thing, stood perfectly still, like even the air had weight now. The group approached the wall slowly. Each of them had something in their hand, a folded document, a plaque, a photo, but none of them added anything. They just stood one by one and looked. The older man with the cane was the last to step forward. He reached into his coat, pulled out a single brass pin, shaped like a lightning bolt crossing a radio tower, a unit insignia so classified most thought it was a rumor. He knelt, carefully, painfully, and placed the pin just beneath Leonard's framed patch. Then he whispered something no one could hear, but whatever it was, it made the youngest officer in the group wipe a tear quickly and straighten his back. They didn't order food. They didn't stay for pictures. They nodded once to the waitress, once to the boy behind the counter, and once, as if he were still sitting there, to the empty booth by the window. Then they left, and the town stayed still for a long while, because some visits aren't made for show. They're made for closure. And in those silent 5 minutes, every person who had ever doubted, mocked, or simply ignored the quiet man at the edge of town finally understood something they could never put into words. They didn't just lose a neighbor. They lost a guardian, one who had never asked to be known, but who had never, not for one moment, stopped watching over them. No statue was built. No street was renamed. There was no parade, number 21 gun salute. No polished plaque unveiled with flashing cameras. But something in the town changed anyway. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in the quiet ways people remember the things they were once too busy to notice. The boy who used to mock from his bike now stopped by the wall every morning before school. Not long, just long enough to nod. The waitress at the diner began putting an extra mug on the table by the window, even when no one sat there. A retired colonel from 2 counties over drove in every other week, ordered coffee, and never said a word. Just looked at the pin beneath the patch and left exact change. The wall never grew much bigger, but the space around it did. People spoke more softly near it. Children asked questions in whispers, and every now and then, someone left something new. Not always military. Sometimes just a drawing, a ribbon, a single word on paper. Thanks. As for the house with the old shed, it remained locked, untouched, but no longer forgotten. On the anniversary of the visit, the one where the general came without a guard and called him by name, the town didn't hold a service. They just paused. The diner dimmed its lights for 1 hour. The local radio station played nothing but static, followed by 5 seconds of pure silence. And someone, no one ever knew who, left a card tucked behind the frame with only this written inside. He didn't raise his voice, but we heard him, finally, and maybe that's what he wanted all along. Not attention, not medals, just for the silence to be understood. He never asked to be remembered. He just stayed silent and kept watching. And maybe now, finally, we're watching back. If the story moved you, help us keep these voices alive. Like, share, and subscribe to Endless Stories, where legacies don't fade, they echo. Endless Stories, where silence speaks and memory stands tall.